everyone, and we're back. It's me, Julia, again, your probably not so favorite host, the rambling host. And I'm so happy today to be joined by Alex Aldridge. Hi, Alex.
Hello.
So nice to have you on the podcast. I'm so excited about you being here because I'm really interested in your work. And also because I heard you speak before and I was like kind of glued to the screen going like, I want more. So I thought I'd sort of reach out to you and just ask you to talk to me a bit more. And yeah, I mean, initially, actually, I'm basically interested in what brought you to do work and research at the intersection between sex and drugs, which are, I guess, two of my favorite topics. And yeah, just the motivation for doing research in this field.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here also. So yeah. So I would say my interest in sex and drugs kind of started when I was working as a research assistant in Manchester, and this was I think it was in 2016. So I was working on a project that was assessing the impact of the new at the time Psychoactive Substances Act on particular groups of people. And one of those groups of people were men who have sex with men having chemsex. And so just to quickly define chemsex, so chemsex, the word chemsex, it's mostly used to refer to like gay and bisexual men using specific drugs, which are crystal meth, mephedrone, and GHB or GBL to like enhance sex. As well, chemsex is usually linked to like group sex, and because stimulant drugs are involved, it's linked to people being up for like multiple days at a time, kind of being engaged in these like chemsex parties. But yeah, so while I was doing the project, I was quite like intrigued by the way chemsex was presented as something that was so like out of the ordinary and something that kind of required this like particular special research attention. Yes. And I was kind of reflecting on, you know, the people that I knew, people who like weren't necessarily gay or bisexual men, but also gay and bisexual men, but not necessarily gay and bisexual men who were also having sex on drugs. And I mean, some of them like pretty much exclusively had sex on drugs, you know what I mean? Especially when you're counting like alcohol as a drug, like sometimes, you know, all the sex they were having was on drugs. And there's just not, you know, the same amount of research there about, you know, these people as there is about chemsex. But yeah, that was, and actually, like you mentioned the talk I gave recently, and I wanted to bring up something that happened in the talk that I think kind of exemplifies one of the reasons why I'm interested in doing like my research. So yeah, I was giving a talk, like you mentioned, on my PhD, and chemsex came up like it often does. And I don't know if it was you who asked me this. Someone asked me this. Well, I thought the difference was between chemsex and sex on drugs more broadly. What do you think the difference is between them? Or do you think, you know, there's a difference between them at all? And I think my response was something like, you know, setting chemsex apart as something different, as something so out of the ordinary, it can, you know, have the effect of like pathologizing chemsex and pathologizing people who do it. So after I said that, I got a comment like in the chat from someone who was attending, and I saved the comment because I thought it was so interesting. And the person said, I wrote it down, they said, I believe that the intentions for having chemsex are different. It's because of homophobia, stigma, and being told that the sex you are having is wrong. Whereas sex on drugs in the heterosexual community might just be for fun and something that just happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't want to dismiss this person's comment at all, because they've definitely raised important points that shouldn't be ignored. But I do think it speaks to a kind of typical dichotomy where we've got gay and bisexual men having chemsex and then straight people having sex on drugs. But then erased from that completely are like queer women. You know, where do their experiences fit? Are their experiences not important? Or, you know, do they not experience homophobia? Do you know what I mean? Like they're just routinely kind of ignored in these conversations.
Yeah.
So when it came to doing my research, I don't want to like split people into groups based on their genders and sexualities and just assume their motivations for having sex on drugs are going to like depend on those identity categories. So I'm just interested in sex on drugs in general, like the range of people who do it. And I just really want to like dig into the details of their experience and just basically find out like as much as I can.
That's so interesting. And like there were so many kind of lights popping in my head as you were talking. Because I recently wrote a chapter in, because we've got a book called Sex and Crime that's just come out, and it's a textbook. So it's aimed towards primarily, I guess, like undergraduate or postgraduate taught students. And we wrote a chapter about pleasurable risk. And within that, we obviously tackled the issue of chemsex, because, you know, and as well as like kind of, I guess, BDSM more broadly. And I think what was interesting in reflecting on on chemsex in the context of the chapter was that, you know, there is a pathologizing and intervening upon homosexual groups through kind of public health regulation, and I think it's like a remnant of the idea that that particular group is risky, has risky sex, and the risky sex of that group is more of a problem for public health than other groups. And I think that issue continues to plague our kind of potential to understand the relationship between sex and drugs in general. And you are right, there are, you know, women's narratives are completely silenced, and as queer women's narratives even more so. And I just think, like, you know, enough in a way of these kind of special categories, which are like, you know, a threat to public health, or, you know, how should we intervene upon them? And I appreciate the whole risk environment discussion, but also I'm bored. I want to kind of overcome that narrative.
Yeah. And
so I feel like, you know, this is exactly where you're at. This is exactly what you're doing, which is great to hear. Yeah. And obviously in the context of that talk, and in a particular focus of yours, is the relationship, issues that are raised in the interrelation between sex and drugs around sexual consent. So maybe you want to tell us a bit more about that, because consent is something that a lot of people are grappling with at the moment in different ways.
Yeah, I really agree. Yeah, so consent is really central to my PhD. And one of the reasons for this is, you know, back when I was actually doing that research assistant job that I just mentioned, I was trying to look for like research that existed about women and sex on drugs, and just didn't really find much. But then what I did find a lot of was research about women who had been sexually assaulted while on drugs. So, you know, maybe they had their drink spiked, or maybe they took drugs voluntarily and then were sexually assaulted. But yeah, so there was loads on that. But what was missing was any engagement with like women's consensual experiences of sex on drugs, or women's like positive experiences of sex on drugs. Obviously not to say that, you know, consensual equals positive, but, you know, either of those basically. So yeah, what I wanted to do was to engage with consensual experiences, or, you know, at least not only focus on like instances of sexual assault. But in doing that, I kind of regularly encounter challenges, because when people talk about drugs and consent, it's overwhelmingly really negative. So, you know, drugs are portrayed as kind of like impairing people's capacity to consent. Drugs are seen to make people, especially women, more vulnerable to being sexually assaulted, like put in a vulnerable situation. So that's why we see messages like, you know, don't drink too much, like stay with your friends, make sure you keep an eye on your drink, like, you know, be careful, be careful, be careful, all those things. But when you actually talk to people, including women, about their experiences of sex on drugs, you know, they aren't all negative. And they aren't all positive either. They're just really complicated. And, you know, people have a tendency to talk about consent as though it's really simple. So, you know, yes means yes, no means no. You know, but it's not simple, because there's so much complex like reading into situations that you have to do, you know, like it's not all done verbally. You have to interpret people's body language. You have to try and work out what they like and what they don't like. And also I feel like sex is also really bound up in like people's egos. Like, you don't saying to someone like, do you want to have sex, even though that might be good, like consent wise, what if they say no and it might be really embarrassing for you? Do you know what I mean? So these are all things like these are all things that people are thinking about, that's going through their heads. And like drugs is another thing to consider here, but you know, I think of it as just something else to consider on top of all the other things that we have to consider. It's not like, you know, sex on drugs makes consent into something completely different. It's like we're still grappling with all these same issues that are relevant to sex and consent anyway. Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So I think overall, just to kind of like reduce the relationship between drugs and consent to a bad one, to a negative one, it really shuts down any kind of opportunity to even consider the opposite. Because yeah, when I've been talking to my participants, I have found that, you know, sometimes they frame drugs as even like enhancing of communication, and so also consent related things as well. I mean, you can see this particularly, which makes sense, with like MDMA. That's obviously one. Weed, cannabis, yeah, to be honest, as well, and psychedelics as well. I mean, those are the ones where you kind of it's most obvious to kind of find those things, but I mean, they're there with other drugs too, you know. So one of my participants, I remember, she kind of said the sex she had on acid, she felt like it was even more consensual than the sex she had like not on acid. And the reason for that was because when she was on acid, she was more in tune with her body, she was more in tune with her boundaries, and she was also more in tune with her partner and like how he was feeling, and it didn't even need to be put into words, they could just tell, that kind of thing. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is just the relationship between sex and consent is just incredibly complex, basically.
Yeah, there was loads of things I picked up on, again, as you were talking. One is the kind of pitting of women as ideal victims within the context of rape culture, and so the onus and responsibility being on them to like drink less, to be careful, to watch out. And so that sort of very much filters through, I think, in the kind of the mainstream discourses that we have, you know, outside, but also in clubs as well, you know, how the messaging in clubs, what that's like, as well as I think the lack of nuance in the stories that and also in research focus, which reflects that, because as you said, you know, when you were doing your research about women's stories, there were none, and the early stories that were prominent in research were about being victimized or abused. So yeah, it's just kind of like it becomes kind of like a vicious circle in some sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's good to kind of acknowledge the complexity and nuance. But what's also good is that, you know, I guess the individual narratives that are able to kind of typify or illustrate the relationship that they have in terms of consent and individual substances which are maybe more likely to enhance empathy or ability to connect and communicate with others. Because what I found from just anecdotal stuff and talking to people and observation was that a lot of the times people's experiences of drugs because of the lack of inhibitions, because of the enhanced ability to communicate, allows them to maybe express certain desires or ideas or wishes that they're not otherwise able to do. And obviously that's just purely anecdotal from like friend stories and kind of discussions that I have with peers, but still I don't know, it's just interesting to me that there's just all these untapped narratives that usually get told in private, you know, between friends, that are not something that we speak about more in public or in kind of media streams, or indeed in research as well. So yeah, I'm just really excited that you're talking about them.
And what you say about that anecdotal like evidence is really reflected in my data as well. Yeah. Being like, you know, ooh, something I've wanted to try all the time, but I've been too shy to say, like, how would you feel about it? And, you know, even if they don't do it then on that time, it's like, you know, that conversation has been had, and that paves the way for like future positive experiences. Yeah. And they feel important. That feels important. You know, it's like enhancing of people's sex lives and good, positive things that, yeah, just aren't talked about.
Yeah, because I mean, for the longest time, sex has been something of a taboo, or something that, you know, people only felt comfortable enough talking about, maybe with close friends, and therefore, you know, and so bringing certain the freedom to express oneself about one's sexuality to even to partners or to strangers potentially, or, you know, or in the media, in a public platform, is, you know, is still very much there, that fear of like, I think, yeah. But I think hopefully, yeah, and I think that that's the kind of beauty of, I mean, obviously I didn't talk to my participants about sex at all, although sometimes it came up as a kind of indirect or sort of sideline issue, that when people were talking about their drug experiences. But certainly there is a parallel in terms of sex and drugs, to the extent that, you know, people feel more liberated on drugs to express themselves and communicate, and some of that communication is done through the body. So it could be sexual, it could be physical through dancing, for example, or just being embodied. So yeah. Anyway, I get so excited, sorry. So yeah, I guess related to that, my kind of my little curiosity now is gonna go into the direction of dance floors, because obviously that's one of the main themes that interests me and of the People in Dance Floors project. So how do you think sex and drugs are connected to dance floors, if at all?
Yeah, I love this question. I really think this question, it speaks to the idea that we shouldn't be viewing people having sex on drugs as like isolated incidents, but more as part of wider events. So instead of just being interested in, you know, the sex itself, also being interested in the build up to it, and, you know, during and what happens after as well. So obviously before COVID, nightclubs were one of the main places where people would take drugs, and they were also one of the main places where you could meet people to have sex with. So, you know, you might literally meet a person you're going to have sex with on a dance floor. So we have that kind of obvious connection there. And also, like, I've talked to people who describe like the dancing they do with people like while on drugs as sexual. You know, like it is sex, like it's part of the sex. Maybe it's the beginning of sex, you know, and then they go home later and they have more sex, but it does feel like part of the sex. And, you know, also like kissing on dance floors as well. Like you go to any club and you'll just see people kissing. I mean, like how can that not be part of sex? Like it happens all the time. So again, just seeing all of this that's happening as part of the wider sex event. Yeah, and we could also like make an even more explicit link that, you know, there are clubs that are sex clubs. So, you know, they're specifically set up for people to have sex in, and they'll have a dance floor, they'll have a room, maybe they'll call it a playroom or something. And sexual stuff can be happening in there, it can be happening everywhere. And then you've also got clubs that, you know, maybe it's not a sex club, but it's got a dark room in it for people to kind of go off and have sex when they want to do that. And, you know, and they're not, and even though it's maybe in another room, it's not like it's separate to the dance floor really, because you can still hear the music going, you can like still feel it, and, you know, it's still very much part of the whole nightclub experience. And then obviously you've got people having sex in clubs even when they're not supposed to.
Yeah.
Club, even if it doesn't have a dark room. You know, one of my participants talked about him and his girlfriend like sneaking off into a bathroom and having sex in there, and then, you know, a big queue building up, and then when they kind of left they were like being all sheepish because everyone obviously knew what they'd been doing. So, and that's common, right? That's really common. And another a woman in my study, she kind of talked about her and a guy she'd met in the night kind of sitting to the side of the club, and like she was sitting on top of him and kind of positioned her skirt in a way that people couldn't really see what was going on underneath. But you know what I mean? They were having sex in the club. So, I mean, I just think, yeah, they're so connected that you can't disconnect them. Yeah. And I think also you mentioned BDSM before. Just to say, like, I'm not an expert on BDSM at all, like, just as a disclaimer, like, I'm not, but it does come up a lot in my research. You know, I have participants who are like very much part of that kind of scene. And I've kind of heard interesting kind of like little tidbits from them about how people on the BDSM or kink scene or whatever kind of talk about drugs and the combination of sex on drugs. So something they talk about is they'll hear things like, you know, oh, you know, if you have to be taking drugs to be involved in BDSM or to be having this kind of sex, maybe you need to reflect on that and, you know, think, you know, maybe this isn't actually for you and you're needing to get off your face to do it. What does that say about you? Or I've also heard some people saying, you know, well, maybe a bit of alcohol is okay and a bit of weed is okay, but any, you know, harder drugs, and then it's not okay. Obviously, using that for harder drugs. Obviously, that's not a very helpful like distinction between drugs, but yeah. So the link with BDSM is there because obviously a lot of sex clubs kind of like involve BDSM and stuff like that. So it's interesting that there seems to be tensions within that scene of whether combining sex on drugs is okay or not okay.
Maybe there's something, you know, going back to your kind of argument around the charm circle, there's something about, you know, the purity of sex, even within the BDSM community, as something being, as you know, sober sex being kind of prioritized as a pure form of expression, and that only when you're sober can you truly consent, or can you truly kind of be, you know, be fully committed to the experience. And so if you need drugs, then it's like drugs are sometimes seen as a cheating mechanism, or as a way to circumvent something, or basically as not something that's pure. And that obviously presents issues around, in different ways. And maybe that's, I don't know, the first thing that came to mind when you were talking about BDSM and the attitudes within the community is, that was straight away was like, bling.
Yeah, people often kind of look to the BDSM community in some ways for like tips for best practice on consent, you know, because there's so many conversations about consent in those contexts that don't necessarily happen in other places. So yeah, it can be interesting where there does seem to be a divide within that community over, you know, the place of drugs and are they okay or not. And the privileging of sobriety is something I find like so fascinating, because it never seems to be, from what I can tell, it never seems to be about sobriety specifically. It's not like, you know, sobriety is better because you're like this when you're sober and you like this and you like that. It's never about that. It's only because there are no drugs. Because sobriety really is not like a consistent state to be in. You know, what if you're like extremely angry or extremely anxious or you know, feeling some kind of heightened emotion? You could maybe make a decision that you wouldn't make in a calmer state or something like that. So like parallels can be made to, you know, oh, well, you wouldn't make that decision if you were sober, but it's like, well, you know, maybe I wouldn't have made that decision if I wasn't angry. So it's like sobriety to me, I don't think it should be held up as this like amazing thing when, it's not one clear thing.
Yeah, I think it's like too often sobriety is taken to mean a state of perfection, of emotional neutrality, and it's like there are so many internal emotional struggles and ups and downs and things that happen that will affect decision making, for one thing. And so there's no point assuming that sobriety is this kind of like perfect state, or like the ultimate state of where you can make all the right decisions and so on.
About as well, like, you know, the drugs we're taking every day that people will still kind of imagine you to be sober on, like, you know, obviously obvious ones like coffee or paracetamol or something, but also like, things that like antidepressants or something like that, or like hormone therapies, things that like do some people report that your mood changes, and like they have significant changes like on the way you feel physically and mentally. And they don't. So but obviously when we're thinking about drugs, usually we're not really like including those things as much. But I have found when my participants have been talking about their experiences, like hormone related things do seem to come up a lot. So I think it's definitely something I don't have fully formed thoughts about, as you can probably tell.
Well, I'm not surprised.
Think about more.
I'm not surprised though, because anecdotally, and from personal experience, hormones definitely affected me and my mood and my sex drive, and like just to the point that I had to come off them, the pill and stuff. It wasn't for me.
Yeah, so. That's so interesting. Yeah, and that's definitely like why should that not be included in drugs, really? Yeah.
Yeah. And I also think that would go some way in destigmatizing substances because they are controlled, because they are scheduled, because they are, kind of in that particular, we talk about class A drugs, as if it's just this category and we lump them all together and they're all the same because they're class A drugs, and hard drugs, like you were referring to before. But it's just we lose the nuance, and we I think that classification is perhaps old and tired. Cool. And like there was so much other stuff that you were saying that gave me ideas, and I've forgotten them all. But I guess one of the things was around sort of normativity and I guess what's considered to be kind of normative sexual practices. And I was wondering whether, in amongst your participants, you could see any differences that drug consumption made to their understanding or practice of sex in a non-normative way. So my, anecdotal experience and knowledge is that people sometimes are emboldened to have less normative sex, or to follow different scripts than the kind of romantic monogamous script as a result of drug experiences or aided by drug experiences. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing to say is that in my sample of participants, people who are in non-normative, non-traditional relationships are quite overrepresented. So like I think over half of them were in some kind of non-monogamous relationship. Like very few of them identified as heterosexual. I think I've got like I'm still in the kind of data collection bit. I think I'm going to end up having between 25 and 30 participants, and I think maybe 3 or 4 of them identified as heterosexual. So that's kind of a first point to note. Mm-hmm. So most of my participants, they're regularly having sex with people other than their partner, and they're regularly having like group sex. And I think drugs are definitely like part of that for them, but also that's kind of the sex that they're having anyway, where they're already not really following these traditional scripts. And something else, I also want to be quite cautious in my research in how much, I don't know, like agency or power that I give to drugs in being able to like affect sexual situations. So because the reason for that is because I think there's a tendency in like sex and drug research, and particularly chemsex research, to see drugs as, you take them and then suddenly you're really horny for sex. You want to have sex for hours and hours. You forget about all the risks. You forget about condoms. But, obviously we know that from like loads of great drugs research that, it's not just, you take X drug and you have X effect. Like this experience is very much shaped by like, where you are, who you're with, your previous drugs experiences, and just loads and loads of other things. So while I think there are like transformative aspects of sex on drugs, like things that you said, trying new things, finding different things pleasurable, these don't just happen because of the drugs, but they happen like in the wider context of the sex on drug event. But yeah, but having said that, I think there is really something to be said about like sex on psychedelic drugs in particular. So first, you've got this kind of like temporal aspect to it where, the people who, when they're tripping, they're not really aware of time in the same way. So when you're kind of having sex, like on average, sex probably lasts, up to an hour. We've got like sex on psychedelics that's lasting for 7 or 8 hours, and you've got to deviate from a normative sexual script there because there's so much time to fill. Yeah. And one of my participants said something that I really loved about sex on acid. They said they do things because they feel interesting or they feel important, like rather than because they feel sexy. So they're not thinking, oh, how does my body look when I do this? Is my partner liking this? It felt like more explorative, is that a word? Exploratory.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like more exploratory and like more playful almost, rather than like still sexual, but do you know what I mean? Like that kind of discovery like nature to it, rather than, I'm just going through the motions and this is what I normally do, and then I switch to this and this and that. And this participant actually also said when they're on acid, they're able to give their cis male partner a blowjob. And when they're not on acid, they don't like doing blowjobs. They won't do them because it gives them gender dysphoria. It's non-binary, but assigned female at birth and kind of undergoing like hormone, kind of self-administered hormone treatment actually. So using testosterone, but kind of illicitly sourcing it themselves, which is quite interesting as well. But anyway, yeah, when they're on acid, these blowjobs, we kind of jointly came to start calling them preconceptual blowjobs because they were able to like give these blowjobs without any like preconceived notions of like woman giving man a blowjob. You know what I mean? It was just like, here's this thing and I'm putting it into my mouth. Like there's nothing more to it than that. I'm just exploring. I'm just like feeling it, or, without the kind of scripts imposed onto it. So yeah, I think there's definitely like something there in what you've said. Absolutely. Just with the caution of like not giving drugs too much power in it and just seeing it as like, yeah, part of all the kind of wider events that are going on.
Yeah, I think it's a classic. I think it's also a classic prohibition narrative, and it's a classic kind of positivist narrative where you've got this kind of like, this substance has agency, and there's kind of like this linear causal thing where it's like you ingest the substance and then it makes you do this and it makes you become like a devil horny whatever. So it's it's very much that narrative, and I think I can completely see why you'd want to be very cautious about giving drugs agency. At the same time, I was like thinking about thinking again, kind of coming back to this idea of embodiment and embodied experience, and how perhaps drugs kind of short circuit something, or some drugs, not all drugs, short circuit something that allows for the mind to stop thinking, how do I look? Do I look good? Am I moving okay? Or like, do I, am I kind of resembling the kind of sexual scripts or the kind of sexual representations that I've consumed and therefore can reproduce or whatever? And yeah, I think in terms of the kind of the people starting off already wanting to have sexual experiences that are non-normative, I also find that interesting, because I think that it's like, I guess maybe there is a queer community, or a more kind of a community that is more interested in different experiences, in risk taking, that doesn't fit into normative schemes from the get-go, and therefore is perhaps more willing to experiment, or to just try different things. Yeah.
Yeah, well, what you said about the embodiment, it feels so important, because I think one of the most common like descriptors or feedback I get from participants about what sex on drugs is like is this kind of enhanced presence, like being in the moment and getting out of your head. It's like, I think almost everyone said that at some point, like about so many different drugs as well. Like it wasn't even specific to one drug. it was, yeah, I mean, probably I'd probably hear it the most about cannabis, but that's just because the sex on cannabis was just so common. So people were describing that a lot. But yeah, it feels like the kind of the key thing that was shared by most people.
Yeah, it makes sense. And certainly, again, sort of reflects anecdotal discussions that I've had with people. Yeah, and I don't know, I don't know, I guess a part of me is interested or fascinated by the potential for kind of drug experiences to allow for that embodiment, or for that moment of embodiment or presence. And of course, people might turn around to me and say, oh, but you can get that through like tantra meditation and so on. And I'm like, okay, yeah, fair enough. But that takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of commitment, and maybe daily practice and exercise and breathing and so on and so forth. And whereas if you consume drugs, then that could be quite instantaneous, and you don't have to make particular efforts in order to reach that state.
Agree, exactly. And that's just that constant thing, if you put work into it and time and effort, then it's more valuable somehow. But I think it's super valuable to be able to get something instantaneously. That's great. And for some people, it can be like a lifeline as well. If you're in a phase where you're not, you're finding it difficult to enjoy sex, you're finding it hard to get out of your head. I mean, like, I've spoken to lots of particularly women who have I mean, men as well, but like definitely particularly women who kind of experience this like hatred of their bodies, and just don't feel like so uncomfortable in it, and it completely takes them out of sex. They don't want to be touched, they don't enjoy it. And so many of them report, like particularly with weed, just being able to smoke and suddenly being like, oh my god, like I'm not having any thoughts, I can just be in the moment, I can just enjoy sex. And like that's a positive thing. And that's not to say that there can't be like connected problems, but I think, and I feel like your recent paper captures this really well, about like coming out as a drug user and stuff like that. Like drug experiences, they kind of always are ambivalent. They're never like 100% good or 100% bad. They're just always complex. But yeah, I feel like we should value those things and take them very seriously.
Yeah, definitely. I just think that we stop short of that because we are so used to binary thinking and dichotomous thinking, and also especially with let's say stuff in relation to vice. Vice, is it like like sex and drugs? But the binary thinking there is just so heightened. It just, we can't seem to overcome it as a people, as a culture. So yeah. And sorry, go ahead.
I mean, I feel like I just going back to your paper again, you could see it like when you were kind of like putting those autoethnographic like excerpts in, you could see like the ambivalence even there. So even when it's, you're a drugs researcher and it's your job to literally think about these things all the time, like I'm always going back and forth between these like binaries that they do feel very, very tough to escape. But I mean, I guess it's just trying to like think of them, all the things at once.
Yeah.
but I mean, yeah, it's hard.
I mean, even acknowledging acknowledging both sides at once, or like having the binary but constantly going back and forth and trying to kind of look at it relationally rather than just one or the other, it's to me already some like a tiny step forward, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, I've got one more question, if you don't mind, about just about how COVID has impacted your research, and whether you've been able to do any digital kind of observation of what's happening, in the context of people's relationship with sex and drugs.
Yeah. I mean, I, like many other PhD students and like researchers, was very gutted when, I mean, like everyone in the world, I was gutted when lockdown happened, but specifically because it meant I couldn't do the field work that I'd planned to do, and that was rubbish. In fact, I got my ethics approval for my project on the first day of the March lockdown.
Oh.
This feels like a slap in the face. But yeah, so I planned to do like it's an ethnographic project which would include some observation in nightclubs. And I have participants who kind of keep diaries about their sex on drug experiences. And then when they return their diaries, I kind of read them, do some analysis, and then we'll interview them, kind of a follow-up type thing. So I was still able to do all that, which was great. But yeah, I couldn't go to the nightclubs. Yeah, and who knows when we'll go to nightclubs again, but I can't do that because it's too heartbreaking. But yeah, but luckily, a lot of party organizers, like all over the world, started hosting parties, mostly over Zoom, but definitely using other platforms as well. And some of these were kind of, sex parties where people were having sex on camera. And yeah, it was interesting because drug use, like, it was happening, but it wasn't super explicit. So, you would see it on camera. You could see people with glasses of wine, smoking spliffs. You could see people having balloons. I mean, you could see people doing drugs that were quite visible. And sometimes also I'd see people taking shots and I think, is that alcohol or is that GHB? But I mean, obviously, like, how can you know unless you know that person? You can't.
But not powders, no powder drugs.
Once at one party, someone got like their phone and kind of like racked up a line on here and did it in front of the camera so everyone could see. But that was not common. And I think some parties as well were kind of like enforcing don't do drugs on camera, because obviously, I mean, like they're navigating these platforms which, are trying to, are like, you can't have sexually explicit content, you can't do drug use and stuff. So they're using these platforms which are trying to stop them doing what they're doing. So it's kind of adds an interesting dimension to what they're trying to do there. But yeah, I mean, it was cool to see them kind of make use of and kind of cheat their way through doing certain things. Many of them would use like multiple different platforms. So, one for video, one for audio, and then they'd maybe have like another separate room for like people to go to if they wanted to be private with other members. So to try and replicate a real life experience as much as you can. Like a lot of them use Zoom breakout rooms for like smoking areas and stuff like
that. That's hilarious.
I know, it was nice. It was really nice. But yeah, I mean, they were quite bittersweet as well. I did speak to some people who would go to them, and on the one hand, I remember going to my first one, and you'd been stuck inside for like a month and you'd not been clubbing. And I mean, like, my social life pre-COVID was very centered around clubbing. That was, I wouldn't go every week, but I'd go every couple of weeks, and it would always keep me going through the weeks. I'd be like, I've got that to look forward to. Yes, I can't wait. And yeah, it was so great. So missing that was hard. And then I would kind of log in and I'd see all these like queer people in great outfits, and like, it was so nice. But then at the same time, it's hard because they're just there, but it's also very out of reach. So it's like, it's a reminder of what you can't have, as well as also giving you something of what you can't have. So yeah, it was very, very both. And I spoke to some of my participants who went as well, kind of echoed those feelings of, it's great but horrible, which was funny. But yeah, I do think these online parties are still happening, but to my knowledge, not to the same extent as they did in the first March lockdown. And I've not really thought of any reasons why that might be less now, but it might be interesting to speculate on why. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's like, to my mind, like, not as many parties are happening because people are fatigued by interaction on digital platforms. So that might be one thing. So they just don't think, and I think even, maybe not just the people as in the punters, but also the people that run and organize these parties as well. Whereas I think maybe in the first lockdown, there was a kind of sense of, let's get together and try to replicate the experience and just kind of, feel like we've still got a community, feel like we've still got a place where we can unite and do the things that we love doing. But I can definitely relate to the bittersweetness of it. Yeah.
I think as well, maybe them not being that sustainable financially. I talked to one party host, who was saying, how that, because a lot of them operated on a like pay what you can afford, or like tipping kind of basis. Here's our PayPal link, like tip us if you can. you know, one of the hosts was like how sad it felt to only be able to pay a DJ like 20 quid for, you know, 8 hours of work, and it didn't feel right. So that could have been an aspect to it as well. But I think as well, you know, like people are still having parties now. Like obviously we hear about them in the news sometimes when the police shut them down, but surely there are lots going on that don't make it into the news and don't get shut down by the police. And I did hear of some organisers who were putting on like more sex focused raves still during lockdown, kind of using various social media, like maybe Instagram, maybe other ones. I don't know which, to be honest, but yeah, to organise them. So they're definitely still happening, I think.
Yeah. The COVID parties, yeah. Yeah, I think, I don't know. Yeah, I like you, I try to engage with some digital interaction and parties at the start of lockdown, but I've now completely recused myself from it because it makes me too sad. But at the same time, I feel like there's I don't know, like I guess like maybe it will be interesting for you to compare your previous experiences of going to parties as a punter in the physical, in the flesh, with the observations that you've had in the digital realm.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots to think about there, and I'm currently like collaborating with another researcher. He's called Christian Muller. I hope I'm not presenting his. Sorry, presenting. If I'm not, what's the word? Pronouncing. I hope I'm not pronouncing his name wrong. But he did a kind of similar thing. He's recently published a paper about these kind of digital chemsex parties he was going to. So we're kind of doing we're just kind of thinking through the differences between the parties we attended. And again, like it speaks to the kind of what we were talking about at the beginning with chemsex being positioned as like something different, something special, something this, something that. So it's interesting to like locate chemsex within wider digital sex on drug parties, and so hopefully some interesting things will come out of that.
That sounds good. I can't wait for the article then.
We're working on something. So hopefully, yeah. And it's been really interesting to compare that, and it's been nice as well to kind of like, yeah, kind of share my reflections of attending these online parties with someone, because like up till I was talking to him about it, I hadn't really spoken to anyone about it. So yeah, it's really yeah, hopefully something soon, fingers crossed.
I just think it's yeah, if you can find good research collaborations, but also like opportunities for dialogue at the moment is like just such a godsend.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for talking to me today and for taking the time. It's been the highlight of my week.
It's been the highlight of my week too. And yesterday was my birthday, so that's very great.
Happy belated birthday, Alex, and thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.